What is an atom? You might be familiar with the idea that an element is a pure substance made of only one type of atom. So pure meaning there's only one ingredient to make that element, and the ingredient is all of the little tiny particles that we call atoms. It's the smallest building block that we know in the universe to make all of the material in the universe, which is true. And that they're really, really small. So for example, this little full stop that I have after the word atoms contains more atoms than there are people alive today. So there's billions and billions of ink atoms, if you like, in that full stop. And that is a good understanding of what an atom is. It's the tiny building block that makes all of the pure substances in the universe. But we can go a little bit further than that, because atoms themselves are actually made up of even smaller particles called subatomic particles. So that just means even smaller than an atom. And those are really what are important when we're thinking about what the atomic structure is like, what actually is an atom. So what do we need to know? There are 3 subatomic particles that we need to know about. And we're going to look at them one by one. So first of all, we have something called a proton. And when you hear the word proton, I want you to think positive. So a positive proton. It's a tiny, tiny, positively charged subatomic particle that makes up part of the atom. Next, we're going to look at neutrons. Again, very, very tiny, makes up part of the atom, but this time there is no charge, there's no electrical charge. Neutron sounds a bit like neutral, which means exactly that. There's no charge, it's neutral. So we have positive protons, neutral neutrons. And I'm looking at these two first because they both live in the same part of the atom. So I will draw some positive protons. Let's just say we have 3, like that. And I will draw some neutral neutrons as well. Now obviously atoms being teeny, teeny, tiny, this is as if I've zoomed right in to an atomic scale to analyse what is inside the atom, but this would be microscopic, sub-microscopic, absolutely tiny. And you'll notice that I've drawn them kind of bunched together. Now this is one part of the atom and it's right in the middle. Now every tiny atom has an even tinier centre, and that is where the protons and the neutrons both live. So we call this part of the atom the nucleus, which is where the protons and the neutrons are. However, there are 3 subatomic particles, so there is something else still to come, and that is the electrons. So what do we need to know about electrons? Electrons are kind of like the opposite of the proton. They are negatively charged. So their job is to kind of balance each other out, and that's exactly what they do in an atom, which I'll talk about in a minute. You'll also notice that in my little diagram at the side, to represent the electron, I've drawn it as a little tiny blue dot. That's because compared to the tiny proton and the tiny neutron, the electron is even tinier. It's super, super tiny. And because of that, and because of its charge, it doesn't live in this nucleus like the protons and the neutrons. The tiny negative electrons orbit round about the outside of the nucleus. And that is maybe where you've seen a shape like that before. So these kind of rings don't really exist, but they just represent that these little electrons are whizzing around the outside of the nucleus. And because they're negative, and the protons are positive in the middle, the little tiny electrons are attracted to this positive nucleus. That's why they don't just fly away and do their own thing. They want to be close to that nucleus because they're attracted to the positive charge of the protons because they're negative. So they kind of just whiz around really, really quickly around the outside of the nucleus. And for future reference, I will call these sort of ring shapes just now orbitals. And an orbital just means a space around the nucleus that the electrons will orbit. So we have positive protons, neutral neutrons, negative electrons. So what does that mean for the charge overall on our atom? Well, an atom is only an atom if it has the same number of positive protons and negative electrons. You'll notice that I've drawn 1, 2, 3 little red dots, 1, 2, 3 little blue dots. And that's not by coincidence, that's deliberate. That makes this an atom because those charges are balanced out. So because atoms have an equal number of positive protons and negative electrons, overall they are neutral particles. So what does that mean? That just means they have no charge. So atoms are neutral overall because they have the same number of positives and negatives, and they cancel each other out. And of course the neutrons don't contribute any charge because they are neutral. Now the last thing that we need to know about this structure is, thinking back to our periodic table, you should remember that going across the way in periods, that's in the rows, that the atomic number is something that starts at 1 in the top left hand side with hydrogen and increases as you go down the periodic table. And I said I would come back to that. So what does that actually mean? Well, an atomic number is something that every element has, and it tells you something about this structure. Because we've said that an element is a pure substance made of only one type of atom. Well, that tells us that every element has a specific type of atom. How do we know what atom is which element? How do I know what element this is? Well, the atomic number tells us that. So each element has its own atomic number, and that number tells me how many protons are in the nucleus of that element's atoms. So, for example, if I look at my periodic table, I will see that hydrogen has an atomic number of 1. So what does that mean? That means hydrogen, if I took an atom, a single atom of hydrogen, I know that it has 1 proton. That's what the atomic number tells me. So in this case, I have 1, 2, 3 positive protons, which means the element that is made up of these atoms would have an atomic number of 3. So if I had to find that in the periodic table, I would go to number 3 and find that it's lithium. And this has to be an atom of lithium because it has 3 protons and the atomic number is 3. They have to match. So the atomic number tells me how many protons are in the atoms of a given element. So what have we learned here? We need to know that atoms are what make up elements, which are pure substances. They only contain one type of atom. And even though we think of them as the tiniest building blocks for all the elements in the universe, there are littler parts, there are smaller parts within the atom called subatomic particles. There's 3 of them. Positive protons, neutral neutrons, they both live in the middle in the nucleus. And then the negative electrons, the third and final subatomic particle, orbits round about the outside of the nucleus. And we can tell what element an atom belongs to by looking at the atomic number, which is just the number of positive protons in the nucleus.